Hello and welcome to Taking Liberties, episode 12. My name is Lee. I'm West Australia. This week, of course, I've got Vikas joining me over in Canberra.
Yo.
We've got Zeev joining us once again in Melbourne.
G'day.
And to make up for a complete lack of any form of competence, we have joining us a very special guest, Sinclair Davidson. He's the Professor of Institutional Economics at RMIT, and more importantly, he is the Australian Libertarian of the Year, which was given out at the recent Friedman Conference. So, Sinclair, welcome to Taking Liberties Radio.
Yeah, hi guys, thank you very much.
So we're going to talk about the budget. If you weren't sick of budget talk last week with Satya, which was really great having him, we're going to talk about it this week. So, Sik, how about you give us sort of your brief overview of what you thought of the budget for this year?
Well, I thought the budget was very Swan-esque, and I think since the glory days of Wayne Swan giving down budgets, we haven't actually improved very much, because it's the same sort of mishmash of silliness and nonsense that we've come to expect over the last 10 years or so. Now, when I look at the budget, the first thing that I do is I turn to the back side of it and I have a look at the numbers. Because in the appendices, it used to be number 10, it's now number 11. In the appendices, they have data going back all the way to 1970-71, and they show you what's really going on. So what's really going on this year is that government revenue will be 23.8% of GDP, and government expenditure will be 25.2% of GDP, leaving us with a budget deficit of 1.6% or nearly $30 billion, which is a lot of money. And the national debt is at 29.7% of GDP, which this year, the face value of that is going to be some $540 billion. So there's a lot of money sloshing around, and unfortunately the budget is in red again. And since the budget went into deficit some almost 10 years ago now, the budget accumulated budget deficits are nearly $388 billion. So we've spent a ton of money that we don't have on things that, from a libertarian perspective, we don't need and we don't want. So that's the bad news. The even worse news is that the government genuinely, honestly expects us to believe that by 2021, we will have a budget surplus of some $7 billion, and that'll be 0.4% of GDP. Now, this number is complete nonsense. Now, the way we know that this number is complete nonsense is that you then turn back to the front of the budget papers and you have a look at the statement where it tells you about economic forecasts. And for the last 10 years, the government's been forecasting the economy is going to grow at a cracking rate, and all of a sudden, we are going to grow our way back into surplus. And the fact of the matter is, to get back into surplus, you've actually got to make conscious choices to cut spending. And that is something that the previous Labor government couldn't do, the current Liberal government can't do, and I suspect in time the forthcoming Labor government won't be able to do either. Cut spending, shrink government, shrink the deficit, shrink the national debt, and actually get the economy going again, and that's not going to happen, and I don't see any strategy for that actually happening. So it's bad news all around. So
just to go to the growth projection, because I think this is just not a problem just for our government. It's for state governments, it's for US government. It seems that everybody loves these rosy projections. I mean, how unrealistic, in your view, are the projections?
Well, if you just have a look, the day after or the couple of days after the budget came out, the ABS put out a wage growth data. Now, wages are growing now at 1.9%. Inflation's growing at 2.1%. Now, sorry, that should be consumer price inflation, is growing at a greater rate than wages are growing. And the budget's assuming it's going to be growing at around about 3%.
Right.
So just in terms of the single largest source of revenue to the government is personal income tax. They're not going to be taking nearly as much personal income tax as they think they're going to be taking. The second largest item to the budget is company income tax. And if you have a look at the company income tax forecasts, they are way over recent trends. So again, you just know that the two largest sources of revenue to government are just collapsing. They're just not going to be there. So it stands to reason, more or less, that the budget is going to remain in surplus for some time. Now, if you have a look at the Howard era,
surplus or deficit?
So in deficit for some time. It's not going to be going back to surplus anytime soon. If you have a look at the Howard era, now we all know John Howard was a big government spender. If we have a look at the Howard era there, he was spending 24, close on 25% of GDP. Nowadays, we've just got baked in 25.2, 25.4% next year. So we've baked in a higher level of government spending. And now we're actually increasing government taxation, or trying to increase government taxation to meet that higher level of spending, rather than actually bring the spending back again. So it's a terrible budget, and it's sort of based on the kind of trickery and sleight of hand and changes in meanings and definitions of words that Wayne Swan introduced when he was treasurer. So since the end of the Howard era, the budget process has really become debased in my mind.
Debased in the terms of its political significance, or debased in terms of what they're actually moving in terms of policy?
Debased in how they describe the policies to us. So a random government spending is all of a sudden an investment. Increases in taxes are a saving. These are profoundly dishonest ways of describing what is going on.
Yeah. Actually, I did notice cancellation of projects would often be referred to as budgetary savings measures, yes. Which I found interesting because the money hadn't been spent, as far as I could tell. Yeah. Well,
it gets worse. If you decrease the rate of spending in a future year, that becomes a cut. And you just think, well, no, actually, a cut to my mind is you spend less than you spent before. Not that you spend less than what you're planning to spend. So all these sorts of things.
As well, I would mention as well, Scott Morrison in his budget speech specifically said that the assumptions that he was making were conservative assumptions. So it's not like they're out there.
Well, to be fair, Zeev, they were assumptions made by a conservative. So conservative assumptions, I suppose.
Oh, okay.
In the literal sense of conservative assumptions.
Yes. I mean, I don't think we can describe them any other way, really.
Just to go to the debased sort of language around budgets, I was listening to an episode of More or Less, which is a British a BBC podcast that talks about statistics, and they were looking at Jeremy Corbyn saying that the Conservatives had got some ridiculous, like a £22 billion cut to the NHS, and what has happened was the NHS said they wanted $30 billion over the forthcoming budgets, and the Conservatives had only given them $8 billion, and somehow they said it amounted to a big cut. And so you hear similar sorts of things in the US where they have these projected spending and they come under a projection, but it's still an increase in growth, but they call it a cut. So I mean, it's just a malicious form of, I mean, it's like almost Orwellian level of talking about budgets.
It's quite shocking. Quite shocking. And of course, the thing is, unless you actually across it and looking at the numbers yourself, you're not going to ever spot it. They will get away with it. And they've got, I mean, both sides of politics in Canberra have gotten away with this for a long time now. But at the same time, they then complain that people are angry and upset with politics. Well, yes, of course they are, because deep down inside, people know they are being misled. They've been lied to.
Yeah, but I find it deeply problematic in the sense that now we're referring to any savings effectively from any government program as a cut, right? What does that mean, like, for libertarians who constantly look for more efficiencies in government, right? Like, particular groups of libertarians, so the minarchists, who argue, there should be more efficiencies in government, and the government should be an efficient organism within the ecosystem of the rest of the economy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does become difficult because when even the language is against you, to try and make an argument for saying we want efficiencies, we want smaller government. People started immediately saying, oh, you're going to destroy the economy because you are cutting. And obviously cut sounds bad, as opposed to saying, well, we're actually going to let you keep your own money and you can spend it on something else. And you're actually going to spend it on something probably more valuable what the government's going to spend it on. So in actual fact, that cut is a growth somewhere else. So it's the whole Orwellian language is actually against us and against the notion of actually shrinking the size of government. It's quite a pernicious problem. I mean, Mises actually makes the argument that in a democracy there are two things that are really paramount. The one is the budget, and two is the rule of law. And we've actually now seen, the whole budget process is being perverted. Now, on the plus side, of course, the budget is still a big deal in Australia. People actually do stop and take notice. So people know it's important, but I don't think people fully appreciate the perversion that's coming over time and how it's described, how things are explained, what's actually going on. That is problematic and probably needs to be fixed up. And, of course, the Liberals always thought that their Charter of Budget Honesty would fix it up. But the problem with the Charter of Budget Honesty is that there's no penalty for getting things wrong.
So just for those who maybe aren't familiar with that phrase, because I think it was a Howard government era type thing that was introduced, wasn't it?
Yes.
So for the benefit of people who maybe weren't paying attention at the time, what is the Charter of Budget Honesty?
The Charter of Budget Honesty is it's not, I suppose you could say it's a policy. It's sort of in legislation, but it's not really law, that kind of requires the Treasurer and the Head of Finance at every election to put out a statement of the true nature of the public accounts and to restate things, stripping out sort of political spin. And so this is supposed to come out every election time. And the idea was that politicians wouldn't be able to lie about their promises given that this document was around and actually stating the true nature of things. So that was supposed to fix things. Or it was supposed to certainly put every 2 or 3 years whenever there's an election, was supposed to sort of give a true state of the books. Unfortunately, it hasn't really worked out that way. And the other thing is the forecasts which the authorities make, the government makes, aren't always that transparent. They aren't even internally consistent. A few years ago, for example, I found that they were forecasting massive rates of investment and therefore massive rates of government tax, of company tax revenue. But of course, with massive rates of investment becomes massive rates of depreciation. So they were putting in normal depreciation rates while putting massive investment rates. And of course, it looked like company tax revenue was going to go through the roof, when in actual fact it didn't. Now, that's a very basic fundamental error that should have been spotted. So the problem around the budgeting process is that you've got to check everything yourself. You've got to look at the numbers. You've got to wade through the spin, the misleading statements in order to get a true picture of things. And that's not how it's supposed to be. The budget is actually the centerpiece of government spending, which is, of course, the primary function of Parliament is to restrain spending and set rates of taxation, which unfortunately our parliamentarians very often are numerically illiterate, and so these things all go by on a nod and a wink, our budget situation is simply not getting any better or improving in any way at all.
Would it be fixed if, say, like the head of finance gave the budget responses? Sorry. If you had, say, the Prime Minister giving one, and you had the opposition minister giving his, and then you had, the finance treasury give out their report, and all three are, separate.
I would have thought that we would have, if we had some sort of ex post auditing process and actual penalties associated. I mean, if companies gave out information to the stock market as dodgy as the government gives us, ASIC would be
they'd be done.
They'd go to jail. So holding the public sector to the same account that the private sector is held to would be a start. Why do you put out this dodgy number?
Can I note briefly as well on that in terms of the in terms of how much the public knows about the false accounting in the budget, I mean, it does to some extent also depend on what sector of the public we're talking about. It is only anecdotal, but I went to a budget night put on by an accountancy firm, and naturally, it was a fairly reasonably well-off audience. And let's put it this way: the partner at the accountancy firm wasn't pulling any punches either. I mean, he was being delicate about it, but he was basically saying that it's a false accounting, and you really can't trust the budget in terms of the return to surplus at all. So, yep. I guess what I'm saying is let's be optimistic that it's not just the libertarians saying this. This is just partners at accounting firms are telling their clients it's not happening, and your taxes are going up, spending is going up, and yeah. So and at least from there, the mood was that people were unhappy with it. So look, let's try and look at it optimistically. People do understand what's going on. A few people.
Sure, but that doesn't matter as much because the people that, unfortunately, and I've said this several times on the show, it's about 15 to 16,000 people in Western Sydney that really control elections, right? And those guys don't give a toss, right? They care about keeping the boat people away. They want their free money, and there's a whole bunch of things that are associated with that. And unfortunately, the political calculus in this country is written up in such a way that they have, by and far, the most political influence in the country.
Yep. I mean, it doesn't matter that the elites and the cognoscenti know that the numbers are dodgy. Is that the public must know that the numbers are dodgy too, and that is the problem.
Just maybe just to take a step back, just to look at the sort of the overall process, because I think you've sort of clearly identified the projections being kind of part of the issue, because the projections essentially allow the government to paint a much rosier picture. Where are these getting these projections from? Like, are they just pulling them out of their ass? Are they sort of hitting Treasury up for a bunch of scenarios and picking the one that I like most? Like, where are they getting this information from?
Well, I wouldn't say pulling them out of their ass quite. I'd say they're pulling them out of very sophisticated econometric models, which some people might say is the same thing. But I'm not sure how it works if the government picks a scenario or Treasury gives a most likely scenario, and then they work within that parameter. So I'm not quite sure the precise details around there. But generally speaking, it is there'd be a unit within Treasury whose job it is to model and forecast these sorts of things and come up with the best guess.
Okay.
And they've got it consistently wrong time and time again.
They have got it consistently wrong time and time again. It used to be in the bad old days, they used to underestimate how things would go and the government could then over-deliver. But what's been happening the last 10 years or so, they've been overestimating what's going to happen and the government has been under-delivering. And unfortunately, this does actually undermine public confidence in our system of government and our system of budgeting, which is, of course, in itself a problem.
That's a very good point. But I guess that brings us to the next point, which is that the biggest budgetary item that they were hoping to bring in the money, and this has caused a lot of mess, is the bank levy, which was tipped to bring, I think, 1.6 billion over the next couple.
It was a big number, yes.
Yeah, it was a very big number, and I think they wanted to stitch it up with the banks being put under a non-disclosure agreement about the terms that they are coming into agreement with the government for. And Westpac today basically announced they will not be shouldering the cost of that levy. It'll be passed on to the customers. And I suspect it'll probably be the home loan customers because they're the least likely to have any mobility. And also, they obviously have the most money that's owed to the banks. So.
Look, I have a very cynical take on the bank levy. My view on that is as follows: is that they had all their numbers and their spreadsheets, and all of a sudden there's a bit of a hole, and they thought, oh my God, there's a hole in our numbers. What can we fill it with? And they say, oh, We'll fill it with a bank levy. We'll tax the banks. Everybody hates the banks, and so you just put in a number. Because we have the most astonishing situation whereby the government can't tell us exactly how the bank levy is going to work, but they know precisely how much money it's going to raise. So I actually suspect that what's happened is they've reverse engineered that number.
Wow.
To fit
Well, they found the
into
number and they're reverse engineering the policy.
Yes. It is an absolute appalling policy, because when the whole basis of your policy is, well, everybody hates the banks and we don't like the head of the new the ABA, you just know that this is actually a bad idea. If they had come out and said, look, we've done our sums and there are deadweight losses and blah, 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 all sorts of techno mumbo jumbo, and to justify this, you could have said, well, okay, maybe we can see it. But in actual fact, there's none of that. It's just a case of we're going to whack the banks because we can and we need the money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now,
They're like kids that going around looking around for a pinata they can whack to get some lollies out of it.
Yes.
But
And now, I mean, from a conservative government, I mean, that's absolutely quite appalling. I think Ken Henry said quite rightly, this is worse than the mining tax. Because at least in the mining tax, there was some sort of theoretical justification. It was nonsense, but there was a theoretical justification. And at the same time, it was going to replace royalties. The Liberals they don't even pretend to have a theoretical justification. They've just gone, we're going to whack the banks, and it's replacing nothing. It's a pure revenue grab.
Yeah, but the thing is, it also, like, the reality is, with so many people on negative gearing, with so many people, trying to pay off their homes, this actually could kill this Liberal government, and it could do it quite easily if the banks choose to pass it on to basically the homeland.
Almost certainly the banks will pass it on to their customers, because one of the reasons why everybody hates the banks is because they've got market power. And when you've got market power, you can pass on costs and levies. So they will pass on those costs and levy. It's not clear to me who they will pass it on to, but almost certainly it will be passed on to the customer base in some form or another. It will drive up everybody's cost. It's got all sorts of perverse incentives, because the Liberals have kind of said, well, banks have got an implicit guarantee, but they haven't actually taxed the implicit guarantee part of it. They've taxed the unguaranteed part of it. So this will, of course, cause the banks to shift their funding towards the bit that's got more guarantee. So it's all very, very, wrong and perverse incentives. It's all crazy policy. It will be passed forward. I think people will feel the pain, because if I were the banks, I would simply say to people, this is the increase due to the government. Write to your member of parliament if you're unhappy. Then, of course, they've picked a fight with the Catholic education system, and they've picked a fight with the independent schools. So they're fighting the banks, they're fighting the high school and primary school education systems. They've picked all these fights. They've got dodgy numbers, a dodgy budget. It just doesn't get any worse from here.
Well, no. There's also the comparisons to Wayne Swan being made. So I'm sitting there and going like, look, Wayne Swan picked a lot more fights than this. Eventually, that's what ended up bringing down that Gillard cabinet.
Yes. But I think when you've got a one-seat majority, you shouldn't be picking these sorts of fights.
Swan didn't even have a majority.
Well, I suppose.
What I find curious, and if I might interrupt at this point, is that the idea that the government should make the case for what it stands for seems to have been abandoned. Now, I mean, leaving aside the particulars of what this government stands for right now, let's say that the government really did believe in what it's implemented as the budget, a massive amount of infrastructure and adjustments to school funding, etc. It just doesn't seem to me as if ministers realise that they actually have to go out every day, every week, in the newspapers, on television, and say, this is why we're doing this, guys. This is why we're calling for these changes. This is why we want you to agree with us. And I'm just not seeing it out there.
Because the answer is that they want to stay in Parliament.
Yeah, well...
Also, sorry, keep going, Zeev.
But this is the problem, I think. I mean, whatever position they're choosing, they're not fighting for it hard enough. And then they're abandoning the last position as too hard. And then on it goes again and again. And maybe, Paul Kelly said that it's a culture problem. Only the News Corp newspapers are pro the right. He said that in a recent editorial. But maybe, and maybe it's just the politicians aren't fighting hard enough.
Well,
I mean, they managed to post surpluses for yonks under Howard.
I mean, I think part of it is also that they're just not competent at doing it. Like, I mean, when was the last time anybody in either the Turnbull government or the Abbott government actually went out there and made a case for some sort of economic reform and didn't look like a complete idiot? I mean, I think part of the issue is they're just not even capable of doing it because, firstly, their policies are complete crap. And anytime they're put into any sort of exposure, they're revealed as total crap. I mean, that's why these are indefensible policies, because they don't make any sense, because they're not coherent, and they don't believe what they really... I mean, they don't actually genuinely believe in reform. They just want to stay in Parliament. And so if you have no conviction in what you're doing and it's total crap, of course you're not going to defend it. You're better off staying at home, because... as the old saying goes, it's better to everybody think you're a fool than open your mouth and confirm it. And so I think that's very much the reason why this government can't defend their policies, because there's nothing to defend. And if they try to defend it, that it look even worse. Well,
actually, they do defend them. If you look in Facebook, there are tons and tons of posts by all of their politicians who are going like, "This doesn't need to happen." And they defend it
in the most broadest of terms of. Yeah, just flowery rhetoric, and it's not here. Let's break it down. They're not doing what we're doing here. Like, they're not going to sit down and do a 20-minute video of going, okay, these are the numbers, and this is how our policies are going to fix these numbers. They just go, everything's great. We're wonderful. The other guys suck. Vote for us.
It's fair. I mean,
that hasn't happened since at least 1998, where we sat down with GST.
Yeah. I'm not, it's not to say that there's some halcyon age where politicians were like that. I don't think they've ever been like that. But it's just to say like
no. I think when it comes to the GST, they were very prepared. They were on top of the detail. There were no birthday cake moments. If you look at back the mining tax, there were definitely birthday cake moments where like Kevin Rudd couldn't explain what a super profit was. And things like this. But if you have a look now, I mean, how are they selling their education business? They're saying, well, it's fair. Well, what does that even mean, fair? I mean, I would never expect a policy to be unfair. So to simply say that this policy is fair is completely meaningless. Tell me about how this policy is going to improve the literacy of Australian kids, which has been deteriorating for years, or the numeracy of Australian kids, which is behind Kazakhstan, or something like that. I'm sure they're wonderful people in Kazakhstan, but they don't spend nearly as much on public education as we do, and they do better at maths than we do, and I would have thought that's a problem.
Did we want to turn to some housing policy discussion before we ran out of time? Because we're getting close to 30 minutes, so...
housing policy. Yeah. I don't know. So there is a Standards & Poor, who's one of the big rating agencies, have downgraded about 23 financial institutions in Australia on the basis that they're currently holding too much debt based on housing. Now, it's only a ratings agency. We know they make mistakes all the time, but it is telling that they think that the housing bubble is going to burst soon rather than later.
I really hope so.
Yeah,
I really hope so, because I've sold my house. More importantly, my wife sold my house. So we don't have a house. I'm going to be homeless soon. But if the housing bubble were to burst, assuming there's a bubble, if the housing bubble were to burst, I hope it would get on with it pretty quickly, because I need to buy again. So on a purely selfish perspective, I'm looking forward to this. On a more analytical perspective, I'm not sure what the trigger would be. So everybody's carrying on about housing prices are too high. But the thing is, we know also in Australia there are massive taxes on housing. On building new housing is difficult. There are supply restrictions. So there are actually good reasons to understand why housing prices are as high as they are in Sydney and in Melbourne. In other parts of the country, they don't seem to be that high. So there are fundamental factors that we can point to, that we can understand. Interest rates are low. So for a housing bubble to burst, we would have to believe that there's going to be some trigger that's going to...
A rate hike?
It could be a rate hike, but generally speaking, I'm expecting when interest rates start rising, they're going to push them up slowly. So it would have to be some massive external shock to the economy. Now, I mean, the global economy isn't traveling well, but I just don't see where this massive shock is coming from. I also saw on the front page of the Financial Review today a story about the interest-only loans are our subprime equivalents. Yeah. But even there again, you have to have some or other shock to the system. The housing market is just not going to collapse by itself because people still have to live somewhere. So
and people are coming here still. That's yes. An important point to make. Australia's yes. population is booming.
Is growing very rapidly. The matter,
and all of those people need to live somewhere.
Yeah, so, but I mean, all else being what about the immigration changes? I mean, that would cause a dampener on the growth.
Yes, but again, that's a decline in the rate of growth.
Yeah,
we actually need to have a sharp turning point of something. And I just haven't seen it. I just don't see what it is going to be. I mean, I'm looking forward to it. I mean, don't get me wrong, but I just can't imagine at the moment what it is that's going to cause this bubble to burst.
I mean, isn't there a rather significant bubble in the Chinese property market? Is that possibly, if that were to burst and somehow, that would tank China's economy, which would then, influence the US? Because from what I understand, China's buying up all the US debt. If the US can't keep rolling their debt over, they're going to have issue. Is that the sort of thing that might...
Well, China's in debt now too.
It could well be, but the other thing to bear in mind, the Chinese money that's flowing into Australia is that these people are trying to get their money out of China. Mm. So it's not like they're going to start selling up here and taking their money home. They're actually trying to get their money out of China and keep it out of China. So we're a safe haven in that regard. So again, it's not clear to me that would be the problem. But I mean, I would love to buy a hugely nice apartment in Docklands, where all the Chinese money is at the moment. So if they start selling up and taking the money home, I'm cashed up and ready to buy. But as I say, it's not clear to me where it's going to happen. But I am seeing more and more predictions that there is a problem in our housing market and that there is a correction due. Bear in mind, the other thing that we could see is not a fall in prices, but a plateauing in prices. Mm. So prices could be flat for another 10 years. And over 10 years, that would be the equivalent of a fall. But in actual fact, it may not actually be the kind of crisis that everybody's expecting.
I mean, I guess we've said...
I could be happy with that.
Yes. I
think the point to be made here as well is that when people talk about housing prices being unaffordable, I mean, again, it is kind of also a relative question to some extent. If one of the interesting things that a publishing a little think tank or research institute by the name of Demographia does, which Alan Moran, your colleague, always puts up on Catalyxy, is they compare median housing prices, roughly, it's a rough measure, to median salary. Yes. So, and one of the key points they make is, look, in Melbourne, for example, the median salary multiplied by 9 gets you a median home. So that's the median salary here is about $70,000 multiplied by 9 gets you a place. You take a look at Sydney, you multiply the median salary, again, probably 75, multiplied by 12. They link it very much to the housing supply as an issue. And they say, look, you've got a booming population. And if you look at places that really restrict supply, those are the places that have the least affordable housing in the world. If you look at the places that don't have restrictions on supply, like zoning, Houston is the one massive example they have. Well, again, the median price there is triple the median salary as opposed to 9 times or 12 times. So, I guess the important point to bear in mind is our zoning laws are crazy. They are the major cause, and they're not changing anytime soon. And our population keeps going up. So I don't really see where this housing bust, if it's going to be significant, even if it is, I don't see how it will fundamentally alter this problem where our housing prices are 9, 10 times our salaries. There might be a plateau, but yeah.
To add to that, of course, is the difficulty around regulation and taxation in building new supply of housing. It takes a long time to get approval. You have to pay a lot of the development costs up front. You've got to carry those costs while the whole thing's going through. So it is a massive supply side problem, really. And so, it's not clear to me that those things are changing anytime soon. I think at best we're going to see a plateauing of prices. I'm going to be incredibly surprised if we see a sharp drop in prices.
So we're just about to run out of time, but before we head off, Sync, if people have loved hearing your views on things, where might they go to hear more from you and maybe other excellent economists and economic thinkers? A blog, perhaps?
Well, there's always catalaxyfiles.com, which has several news stories every day and several open threads per week where people can vent and discuss and read some excellent economic analysis and political analysis, both local, international. If you want to find fellow Trump supporters, we've got them all. But no, more seriously, we've got some ongoing economic, political analysis, local, domestic, international, from people who are more conservative than libertarians all the way through to people who are more libertarian than conservative, and always a very vibrant discussion going on in all the various threads. So if you want to hear more, read more, see more, link into more like-minded people, please, catalaxyfiles.com is the place to be.
It's a great website. And in fact, it has an article by our very own Zeev, who posted that bail article which we talked about a couple of weeks ago. So
many articles.
Yeah, many. That's true.
Yeah.
So
A few, more than a few.
more than a few.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Sinclair, for coming in and joining us this week.
Thank you so much.
And hopefully we'll be able to have you back on again. And thanks, Zeev and Vikas. And of course, check us out. Subscribe to us on iTunes. Subscribe to us at YouTube, Taking Liberties Radio. And thanks for joining us again.
Thank you.